There you go.
Great. So I'm Steve Reddington from Barwon Water. I'm the program manager of the Energy and Carbon program. This program has had a few different names over the years, I think, and its scope has changed a little bit. So I think at one point it might have been called the Asset and Power Optimization Program or something like that. But since the beginning of last year, it's been called the Energy and Carbon Program, which is when its scope was expanded to not just look at energy use, but also looking at emissions reduction, carbon emissions reduction. Oops. So just for context, Water for Victoria, that's the state water plan, which was released in 2016, sets the objective that our water sector will be a leader in the state's climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. So when we talk about emissions reduction, we're talking about climate change mitigation. And that's really important at a state government level, because the water sector makes up approximately 24% of Victorian government sector emissions. So we are the biggest focus, but we're also setting the lead for all of the different government sectors across the state. As you are probably all aware, each water corporation has a target which is set out in the Statement of Obligations for emissions reduction that we're all working to meet. And the long-term objective is that we all reach zero net emissions. For some of us, that's by the year 2030, and then others it's closer, further out, closer to 2050. So how does the program operate? In terms of meetings and networking, there was actually already a group set up, the IWA Energy and Greenhouse Special Interest Group, which predates IWN. So rather than setting up a separate set of meetings and a separate membership, essentially that is the membership for the Energy and Carbon program, and those are our face-to-face meetings. So there's 3 of those SIG meetings a year, and the location of those sort of moves around the state, but typically not too far from Melbourne. Then we have our projects, which I like to say are team driven, because it's, this is not a one-person job. We've got a lot on our plate, so we do rely on people putting up their hand to be a project manager, and to be on the project teams to drive those projects. And those are aligned with the whole of industry priorities around emissions reduction, and also managing energy costs. We do collaborate with a number of different organisations: the Water Services Association of Australia, Water RA, DELP Emissions Reduction Working Group, Vic Water, Carbon Offsets Working Group is a new one that's just cropped up recently. So we're doing a lot to try to minimise duplication and make sure that we're capturing the work that others are doing. So just taking a step back, in terms of the emissions profile of the Victorian water industry, electricity is the largest source of emissions. Grid electricity use is the largest source of emissions across the industry. And then the second largest source of emissions is actually fugitive emissions from wastewater treatment. So I'm going to step through a couple of examples of the projects that we're doing to manage those. So really the flagship example for our program is the Zero Emissions Water Renewable Power Purchase Agreement, or PPA, which I think we actually commenced that way back in the beginning in about 2015. We just had a very loose concept that, hey, behind the meter renewable energy projects, that's not everything. We can actually go out there and invest at a very large scale, and achieve some great economies of scale, and jointly leap forward in terms of our renewable energy usage and our emissions reduction. And in the end, we arrived at the option of entering into a power purchase agreement with a third-party owned facility. So that is the Kyamal Solar Farm in northwest Victoria near Oyen. There are 13 participating water corporations in that, and we've contracted about 15% of that 200 megawatt solar farm. So currently that is the largest solar farm in Victoria. And the volume that each of us has contracted is about 20 to 50% of our electricity use. And not only does it reduce emissions, but it also helps to manage costs. So that solar farm should start operating later this year. Looking at the fugitive emissions from wastewater treatment plants, there are two different types of fugitive emissions that we get from the wastewater treatment process: nitrous oxide and methane. And they both come from, they're both a byproduct of the biological process. So the biological decomposition of carbon, as well as the nutrient reduction of nitrogen. So we've got a couple of different projects in this space. One that we're currently working on scoping up with Water RA is a state of knowledge piece to capture all of the existing work and current work that's being done across the globe. So understanding of the real life performance of different plants in terms of their nitrous oxide emissions in particular needs a fair bit of improvement. The studies that have been done to date show that there's a lot of variability, and so we need to understand that better so that we can optimize our processes to not just get the quality of the end product right, but also to optimize the emissions. And there are what we've seen is there are some examples where we can implement process changes that actually make things worse. So we want to avoid those situations. A project that we have committed to, and the University of Queensland is currently seeking government funding to fund the remainder, is looking at nitrous oxide emissions from mechanically aerated wastewater treatment plants. So a lot of work in the past has been done on plants that use diffused air aeration from the bottom of the tanks, and there's well understood methods for measuring the emissions from those processes. But what we don't have a good understanding of is those processes where you've got a surface aerator, for example, which is creating different zones across the process, and parts where it's much more difficult to measure what the actual emissions are in that process. So we had a fantastic presentation from a professor from the University of Queensland at the Energy and Greenhouse Special Interest Group just a few weeks ago. And she took us right through the technical detail. It was, yeah, for a lot of people, it would be really difficult to get your head around, but it was actually really good to see this detail. And what it shows is that there are actually multiple steps in the biological process, different bacteria that drive different conversions of nitrogen into different compounds. And so nitrous oxide can actually be created at 3 different steps in that process. So this is quite complicated, quite a complicated thing to understand, and it's really important that we get this right, because these sorts of emissions are ultimately unavoidable. So we can minimize them, but we will not be able to avoid them, which leads me on to the next project proposal here, which is a carbon offsets investigation. So because we have emissions which are unavoidable, and we are going to need to mitigate those in order to achieve zero net emissions, we're going to need to match those unavoidable emissions with reductions elsewhere. Now, examples of that are carbon sequestration through tree planting, or soil carbon. There are also other examples where we actually invest in reducing other sources of emissions to achieve that net outcome. So at the moment, there are a couple of water corporations which are very advanced in terms of their understanding of the opportunities around carbon offsets and navigating the different options and how you prioritize things like co-benefits. So for example, you can do catchment carbon offsets where you're actually achieving an improvement in water quality discharged into the waterways, which might be in your drinking water catchment. So that's one option there. And so the purpose of this project will be to capture all of the information on what all of the different options are, present that in a manner so that everyone can get up to the same level of understanding, and then have those conversations around, okay, what are the rules? You know, are we after offsets? You know, should we say all of our offsets have to be sourced within Victoria? Is it within Australia? Is it globally? And what, you know, should we prioritize particular types of carbon offsets over others? A project that I'm pretty keen on because Michael Thomas and I wrote the business case for this capital investment at Barwon Water originally. We've got a 300 kilowatt solar array and a 200 kilowatt hour 180 kVA battery, lithium-ion battery at Werribulloch Water Treatment Plant, which is Geelong's main water treatment plant. And we would love to do a study into how to get best value out of this battery. So we're thinking about, okay, the operating philosophy of this, you know, when should we charge it? When should we discharge it? How fast should we do that? And how do we interact with the energy market to optimize the value of that? And so that could be through exposure to spot pricing, so the real-time pricing of energy in the market, which is influenced by that supply-demand, that real-time supply-demand balance, currently in half-hour intervals, but changing to 5-minute intervals in about a year, a bit over a year now, I think. And there's also the ancillary services market, which is the really fast response services to balance out the frequency of the grid if it gets a bit out of whack. So it's largely a desktop exercise, which is great news while we're in this COVID-19 situation. And we're currently speaking with Deakin Uni, Melbourne Uni and others. They seem to have a bit of a network of people that are keen to work on this. So we're currently working with them to try and get a proposal scoped up. So how to get involved in the energy and carbon program? Well, first of all, check that your organisation has a representative on the IWA Energy and Greenhouse Special Interest Group meetings, and that they're attending those. Talk to us about any project ideas that you've got. We've got a fair bit on the plate at the moment, but it's great to keep a list going of what we're going to do next. And if you've got a particular passion, then please join a project team or lead a project. Any questions? Take that as no. Hand back over to Cameron.